Okay, well, welcome back for session 9, part 2, where we will continue on our study about Book of Revelation, and we're going to pick up here in just a moment, really with chapter 18, because we all the intervening chapters between 12 and 18 we did last time, so we're able to go to chapter 18. Before we do that, however, I do just want to be able to make... This is kind of an aside, and it's kind of funny, but also in a sort of a dark way, but I don't know, maybe this is just kind of my sense of humor as well. Or just a weird way. I don't know, it's dark, it's just weird. All right, so on the topic of sort of apocalyptic literature and Mary. A couple weeks ago, I found in the church a little pamphlet that someone had left, and it's called the Marian Movement of Priests, and it's specifically kind of an urgent call asking. Let me get this. This message. This is on this little tract here, and again, this was just something that somebody had left in the church. And it's addressed to priests, so I assume it was left for me, I guess. I know, you'd think that just leaving messages in church would probably be, but anyway.
Where in the church?
Like on one of the little tables where people, you know how people leave like little prayer books and stuff inside the church, and then I don't know. It's weird. No, it's... So this is the note that comes along with it. This message is an urgent plea, a cry for conversion from our Heavenly Mother, a last desperate effort to bring her children back to Jesus. She is asking the priests to go and to reach out to her children, to all. And then it talks about this Marian movement. And then there's a several long number of paragraphs here that talk about these messages from Mary, presumably at least, that are recorded here in this little tract. That are it says, "Our Lady speaks to her beloved priests." I'm not going to read through a lot of this, but a lot of the images here are really very apocalyptic kind of style of writing that's happening in here. It says that here's a little excerpt. Times of great return. These are the times of my strong admonition. This is Mary speaking, presumably Mary speaking. Come back, O humanity, so far away and depraved. Come back along the road of conversion and return to the Lord of your salvation. These are the times of the great return. You are here because I want to make of you instruments of this appeal of mine. Go down from here to all whoever you meet, in all the countries to whichever you return. You must proclaim this and spread this motherly, anxious, and urgent to the little ones, the poor, or this urgent message. Come back right away to God, to the God of your salvation and peace. The time has been granted to you for your conversion is almost over. The days are counted. Come back right away along the road to return to the Lord if you want to be saved. There are then continued parts here that talk about the times of great chastisement, the times of rebirth, and the reign of Jesus and the great Pentecost that will come. So very apocalyptic, right? And it sounds like it should be coming straight out of Revelation, right? And in fact, you know what it almost reminded me of even more than Revelation per se. It reminded me a lot of what we were talking about in one of the earlier lectures about some of the end time preachers. Remember when we talked a little bit about that? How there's these end time preachers, and they were always saying how the end of the world is going to happen definitely soon, so you definitely need to buy my book right now because definitely very much, reminiscent of that. By the way, I found the book that is connected with this Marian movement of priests. In fact, I found that I had 2 or 3 copies of it in my library. I have no idea how I ended up with these. That were going in there. Gifts, exactly, right? The same way that the tract here was a gift. To make sure that I could be able to do this. This doesn't even have an imprimatur on it, which is to say that there was a bishop who looked at this and said, okay, so what an imprimatur says is there's nothing contradictory to the faith. Okay. Which is not exactly the same as saying it's true, or that everything in it is the way, should we urgently return to the Lord? Yes, obviously, right? Always, right? If we have sin, should we come to the Lord and know His gift of mercy? Absolutely, right? But again, this very apocalyptic, and you remember the wording on here, right? It's as if Mary was saying this, right? And it's saying, come back right away to God for your salvation. The time granted for conversion is almost over. The days are counted. Come back upon the Lord, to return to the Lord, if you want to be saved. The date on this tract of when it was published was 1987. So, I don't know, 30 years later, it doesn't surprise me that there's always people who are talking about the end of the world. That doesn't surprise me. That's always been the case, throughout the history of humanity, right? And there's always a sense in which it is always an urgent message for us, because we never know when the end of our days is going to be, right? And I think every generation goes through a moment of crisis when they realize that, here I'll just use some examples. You got, say like, maybe you have, your greatest generation, and they become absolutely panicked and paranoid when the baby boomers come around, because, they're going to destroy everything that was good about America. And then the baby boomers come around and they're just, hate the fact that these Gen Xers and these millennials are just ruining the world, the country, So like, there's always this sense of like the world is going to end, because it does, it changes, it changes every generation. It changes with these big events that happen, and the old way dies off, And so there is always this sense, I think it's wrong to try to translate that into as if this was like God speaking that this is the end of the world. No, it's not the end of the world. It's just,
But wouldn't you say in the scheme of things we are at the end? Because when you compare it to Genesis and how it foreshadowed everything, pretty much what we're going through.
Right. Are we in the end times right now? So according to some ways of
time,
right. So in gosh, I can't give you a source for this, but I do know that this is part of the tradition, that to be able to say that yes, we are in the end times. Everything after Jesus is in the end times. And that's already been 2,000 years, and we have no idea whether that's going to be another year or another 2,000 or 10,000 or what, that's going to mean as far as, the completion of the end times. So anyway, I brought this up. It's kind of an aside, again, a little darkly humorous in its way, just kind of like, this is such a weird thing, but it's sort of if you will, we talked about the end time preachers, that they go around and they write these books and they have these predictions and stuff like that. Yeah, we have Catholic versions of those too, right? Yeah. And this seemed to me to be a sort of an example of that, and I would have felt a little bit bad about that and picking on whoever it was, except for this happened personally 30 years ago. The guy who wrote it is probably dead, and they left it in my church, and mentioned to the priest. So I guess I feel like I can do whatever I want with it, Okay.
They knew 30 years
Yeah, maybe 30 years from now, somebody will be looking at my thing and be like, "What the heck was he talking about?" Probably. Okay. So again, we're gonna flip forward and go to chapter 18. The intervening chapters between chapter 12 and chapter 18. What happened? We had. So the dragon against the woman, and then we had the first beast that comes up from the deep, and there's the persecutions that begins, and then there's the second beast, and then we talked about the lamb's companions. We talked about the harvest of the earth. So there was some preparatory things of setting up kind of the conflict that was going to happen. There's the heavenly woman, and then there's the harlot. There's the beast, and then there's the lamb, and then there's the false prophet, and then there's the true witnesses, right? And then by chapter 15, we got to the 7 last plagues, right? And these are the 7 bowls or cups or chalices that are poured out. And we noticed, and gosh, I would love to spend more time on this. We're not going to. But I would love to spend more time on this, how the 7 chalices or cups kept giving us images that tied us back to the passion narratives of Jesus, and how the last of the cups ended up with this word like, "It is finished," which is what Jesus said when he was at the cross, was, "It is finished." And there's this sense of the great victory that happens of God both at the cross and here in this passage of Revelation, the end of the 7 cups, the last of these 7 things, right? We have the 7 scrolls, or the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and now the 7 cups. The last of all of them, it is finished. There's this great victory, this kind of full victory that happens, and that somehow that's connected with or keeps alluding back to the cross and the passion, in which I guess also there's this, that's also the place of the great victory, right? In Jesus himself, this is when I will be raised up and I will be glorified, and this is where the kingdom of God is. I can't go into all the details of it, but okay.
Is this the reason you picked number 7 a while ago?
It is, because Revelation, you can't pick any other number other than 7. I guess I could have picked 12, but...
Or 1,260 or whatever.
Or 1,260, or 2 plus 1 plus a half. Come on, man. You've already put it in code. You don't have to code the code, okay? All right. So what we saw was then there's this kind of this conclusion, the end of the plagues, and all of the sort of amassed enemies of the people of God are vanquished, right? That's what we saw kind of at the end of chapter 17, right? Or in 17, we got the angel who told us the meaning of the symbols of the woman and the harlot and the beast and so on and so forth. Okay, so now we're in chapter 18. This is the lament over the fall of Babylon. And so, of course, the context for this, I'll just read this out in its full, but the context for this is God has just vanquished the enemies, right? And so the beast and the woman have been vanquished. And they have been sent out into the desert, and so now we have this description of the mourning over the fall of Babylon. So this is sort of the lament over what, like the fall of the powers of this world, right? So this is not whereas the God's holy people are up in heaven praising, right, and happy because they're saying, praise be God who lives and reigns forever and ever, right? Here we have the mourning of the people who were attached to the powers and the allurements of this world, right? Something like that. Okay. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth became illumined by his splendor. He cried out in a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a haunt for demons. She is a cage for every unclean spirit, a cage for every unclean bird, a cage for every unclean and disgusting beast. For all the nations have drunk the wine of her licentious passion. The kings of the earth had intercourse with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her drive for luxury. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Depart from her, my people, so as not to take part in her sin and receive a share in her plagues. For her sins are piled up to the sky, and God remembers her crimes. Pay her back as she has paid others. Pay her back double for her deeds. Into her cup pour double what she poured. To the measure of her boasting and wantonness, repay her in torment and grief. For she said to herself, I sit enthroned as queen. I am no widow. I will never know grief. And therefore her plagues will come on one day, pestilence, grief, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. The kings of all the earth who had intercourse with her in their wantonness will weep and mourn," this is the lamentation part, "over her when they see the smoke of her pyre." A pyre here is a funeral cremation. They will keep their distance for fear of the torment inflicted on her, and they will say, "Alas, alas, great city, Babylon, mighty city, in 1 hour your judgment has come, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn for her, because there will be no more markets for their cargo. Their cargo of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, fine linen, purple silk, scarlet cloth, fragrant woods of every kind, all articles of ivory, and all articles of most expensive wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, and frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves, that is, human beings. The fruit you craved has left you. All your luxury and splendors are gone. Never again will one find them. The merchants who deal in these goods, who grew rich from her, will keep their distance for fear of the torment inflicted on her. Weeping and mourning, they will cry out, Alas, alas, the great city, wearing fine linen, purple and scarlet, adorned in gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour, this great wealth has been ruined. Every captain of a ship, every traveler at sea, sailors and seafaring merchants stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her pyre, What city could compare with the great city? They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and mourning, Alas, alas, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea grew rich from her wealth. In 1 hour she has been ruined. Rejoice over her, heaven, you holy ones, apostles and prophets, for God has judged your case against her. A mighty angel picked up a stone like a huge millstone and threw it into the sea and said, With such force will Babylon the Great be thrown down, and will never be found again. No melodies of harpists and musicians, flutists and trumpeters, who will ever be heard in you again. No craftsmen in any trade will be found in you again. No sound of millstone will ever be heard in you again. No light from a lamp will ever be seen in you again. No voices of bride and groom will ever be heard in you again. Because your merchants were the great ones of the world, all nations were led astray by your magic potion. In her was found the blood of prophets and holy ones and all who have been slain on the earth. So that is chapter 18, a fairly long chapter actually. Okay, so a couple things in general, and then some details on this one. So let's put ourselves into the historical context. We are Christians living in around the consensus seems to be about the 90s AD. 60 years after the time of Jesus, more or less. The Christian movement is spread throughout different parts of the world. We're in eastern part of the Roman Empire, right? Persecutions have been happening on and off again, right? And we have this text that comes to us of these visions, right? And we're reading this, and we're reading this, and we're understanding the meaning of it because, we heard that Babylon, right? The code name Babylon is the code name for Rome, right? The code name for Rome. We've been talking about that. So then we hear this. Heard a mighty voice cry out, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." We understand what this means, yes? There's a kind of a prophetic message that's being said here that Rome, as it exists as the oppressor of God's people, right? The place that is, how does it say it here? Babylon, in her was found the blood of the prophets and the holy ones and all who have been slain on the earth, right? So Rome, in as far as Rome is this entity that is persecuting and killing off the holy ones, killing off the members of our Christian community, right? If we're putting ourselves into the shoes of these people, right? We get this long chapter here that describes about the fall of Rome, right? Okay. That's a kind of a prophetic thing because it hasn't happened yet, right? Not for the people, in this time. It hasn't happened yet. But that's what they're anticipating, right? They're kind of expecting that this is going to happen. And what is it that's so we have this long chapter here, and it goes through a lot of let me look at a couple of the images here. A couple things I've highlighted in verse 2. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. We've already talked. Babylon the Great is Rome, right? That's what we're talking about here. The power of Rome. Verse 3. The nations have all drunk of the wine of her licentious passion. The kings of the earth had intercourse with her. What is this? This is idolatry, right? We've talked about this before, that the sexual imagery here means idolatry, right? The kings of the earth had intercourse with her. They were united with Rome, and they gave themselves to the idols of Rome, right? That's the idea here. And then it says that the merchants of the earth grew rich for her drive, for her luxury. Rome, I don't want to get into too deep of a history lesson here, but Rome was pretty famous for the fact that the way that it got rich is it stole everybody else's stuff. That was pretty much their MO, right? Like that was the way that they became the richest, most powerful, people in the world. They stole everybody else's stuff. They were the bullies of the ancient world, and that's how it is that they accomplished this stuff. You think of all the sort of the great achievements of Rome. Their great architecture and things, and sculptures and stuff like this. Yeah, they pretty much stole all that from Greek culture and then just kind of made their own versions of it. Like they didn't come up with that stuff. They just stole it, right? Even a lot of they stole their gods. They stole the Greek gods, and then just like as one of my professors says, they stole the Greek gods of like Zeus or something like this, and they just filed off the serial number, and then. And then said, no, it's Jupiter, greatest and best. Do you mean Zeus? No, we definitely mean Jupiter. This is a Roman god, Anyway, so without getting into all this sort of thing, there's a deep connection in Roman history of oppressing over other people and stealing all their stuff. And so there's this whole thing about slavery and enslavement and power and war and and greed and all of that's kind of tied up together. Now, there's a lot in this one that really specifically seems to be, man, these guys have a real thing. There's a real thing in this against the merchants, who are going around and making all this, and all these luxurious items, that we take for granted, nice fabric and and spices and stuff like that. Like we take that for granted, right? There's kind of a big thing about it. I think there's a reason for that though, so I'll get to that in a second. Anyway, so that's 3. Verse 4, it says, "Depart from her, my people." So this is the God speaking to his people. You depart from her, my people. Don't be involved with Rome, right? Why? So as not to take part in her sins and receive a share in her plagues, right? And we've talked a little bit about this before, that those who worship the idols become unto like what they worship, right? So you worship the living God, choose life. You will choose life and have kind of life to the fullest, right? You decide to worship the idols of this world, you become unto like them, and then they bring death and destruction. Especially these idols. You want to think about what Rome stood for. Its idols, was again. There's this deep history of warfare, greed, oppression, so on and so forth. Verse 6, "Pay her back as she has paid others. Pay her back double for her deeds. Into her cup pour double what she poured." It's kind of this... how do we want to say this? That well, we talked about this one a little bit last time too. The idea that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And those who are enslaved will go into captivity, or destined for slavery will go into captivity. So there's this idea that the punishments of God are going to be the consequences of sin. So if you practice violence, violence is going to come back upon you, right? So there's this, there will be paid back for her deeds, and here it's here paid back double, pour out double what she poured. So it's this very strong judgment that's coming onto it. To the measure of her boasting and wantonness, repaid in torment and grief, right? So as high as she tried to exalt herself, she will be brought low, right? That's the idea here. She says, "I will be his queen. I am no widow. I will never know grief." And yet here, exactly all of these things happen, right? Babylon has fallen, and all of her great, accomplishments and her power and her wealth and her, position are being destroyed. We talked a little bit about this already, some of these other verses, so I'm not going to go into all the details of each one of these. They spend a lot of time outlining all of these luxurious items, right? Okay, so there's part of this could be, again, the read of the idea of that it's the, that it's kind of this greed and this oppression that's happening through Rome. But they're specifically saying that it's kind of the merchants. So this is not really like an army coming in and stealing everything. It's really kind of about these, judgment against these sort of rich people and their luxuries and their fineries that are becoming part of this. Think back, if you will, to chapter 3 in one of the letters that Jesus wrote to the different communities, right? One of the communities, he said to them, "You think that you are rich because you have many, basically, material possessions," right? He says, "You do not realize that in fact you are poor and naked and empty, kind of in a spiritual sense," right? So all the way back in chapter 3, we had already a warning of mistaking material wealth for spiritual goods, right? That you can't substitute out material wealth for what is going to be really important, which is the spiritual goods that you should be seeking for, the goods of the Spirit, not just the goods of this world. Also, we're going to, the other side of this is you see the riches, they're mourning over the loss of these riches that belong to the city of Babylon, right? And yet, in a little while, a couple more chapters here, we're going to hear about the city of God. We're going to hear about the heavenly Jerusalem. And it's not just a place where they have merchants who sell and buy and sell jewels and gems and gold and silver and stuff like that. You guys probably already know some of these things. You know, the city of God is paved with streets of gold, right? There is a level of wealth that is to be found in the city of God that is so far incomparably more. That's the imagery that's being used here, right? Than what you could find among the merchants here in the city of Babylon, right? So we can get sidetracked by the wealth of this world and what it can do for us, but how incomparably more precious is the blessings that can come, in the city of God, right? In the reign of God, right? So we shouldn't get sidetracked by the wealth of this world. I think that's part of what's going on here, the contrast of these two cities, Babylon that's fallen, and then we're going to see the exalted heavenly Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, also, there's all these merchants, who deal in goods. Which, by the way, guys, you remember back in two chapters back before this when we talked about how the entire world was destroyed, right? Everything, earth, sky, seas, waters, everything was destroyed, right? Except apparently all of the people who are mourning over, and all the merchants in the sea, and all the other people, right? This is, again, just to point out that, we shouldn't be treating this, we should be treating this as what it's meant to be, symbolizing and meaning, not as a sort of overly literalized version of the events that are going on here. But anyway, so there's all these merchants, and they're mourning over Babylon, but they actually don't care about Babylon, do they? They're all like, oh no, we have no place to be able to make more money off from our dealings. This is going to seriously cut into our profit margin. Oh, woe to us, fallen is Babylon the Great, right? They actually don't care. They were, this was this, they're ready to move on to the next market if that's, what it takes, right? So anyway, there's a little bit of that. There's a lot of things that will not be happening in, no melodies. I'm jumping ahead. Verse 22. No melodies of harpists, musicians, flutists, trumpeters will ever be heard in you. No craftsman in any trade will ever be found. No sound of the millstone to be heard in you. No lamp from the lamp, no light from lamp will ever be seen in you again. No voice of the bride and bridegroom will ever be heard in you again. This, again, you're just going to have to kind of keep this in the back of your mind because when we talk about the heavenly city, we'll see a number of these things that are present, right? That there is a light in the city of God, whereas the city of Babylon, which has fallen, has no light, no lamp, no sun, no light, that there is a light that shines all the time, in the city of God. There's no voice of the bride and groom. There's no sound of the love between the husband and wife. This again is, just keep that in the back of your mind. It's an image that will come up again when we talk about the heavenly city as opposed to this city of Babylon the Great that has fallen. All right. So that's a couple of the images that I wanted to focus in here, especially on 18. Before we leave this chapter, though, I want us to do a little bit of historical thing. So we're going to have to step outside of the text a little bit here and do a little bit of a historical analysis or historical vision on the fall of Babylon as prophesied in this text, right? And that the people at that time were hearing this text and they were receiving it as God's word and in anticipation that this would be fulfilled, but they didn't see it happen. But we, centuries later, can actually study the history of what happened with that. So let's take a little minute and look at the history of what did it look like when there was the fall of Babylon, as it were, well, the fall of Rome. Although, okay, let me just try and give a brief history lesson then of what happens here. So we're talking, when this is written, again, probably about 90s or so AD. Persecutions were happening throughout the Roman Empire against the Christians. But what happens? Despite the continued attempts of the Roman government and to get rid of this religious group of Christians, despite the fact that they kept trying to do that, and it wasn't always in every single place, but occasionally, sometimes they'd just be like, you know what, there's too many Christians around here, we're going to get rid of some of them. They realized that Christians were undermining the sort of fundamental power structures of what made Rome as an empire work, right? Why? Because the Christians were saying, Christos Kyrios, Dominus Christus, Christ is Lord, which is to say that they were not saying Caesar is Lord, that the emperor is Lord. They're saying that Jesus is Lord and that their absolute, full, ultimate allegiance lies with Christ, not with Rome. So Rome correctly understood that this meant that these were people that would oppose Rome if the Roman rule ever contradicted what Jesus said, right? Because Christos Kyrios, these are the people that say Jesus is Lord, and they will follow Jesus. If it comes down to having to pick who they're going to follow, Caesar or Christ, they're going to follow Christ, right? And, there were practices in the Roman Empire that were contrary to the way Christ would have us do things, right? And so the people would follow Christ instead of following the orders of the emperor. Now, this came to a head, especially when things like, the Romans would say, all right, if you're going to be a citizen of the Roman Empire, then you have to be worshiping in one of our approved religious centers, and the Christians would say, no, that's not how we operate. Christ is Lord, not Caesar, so we will worship Christ and not the idols, right? So that's where, the conflict could come into place here, right? So the Romans did what they often did when they came across a group that they wanted to be able to get rid of, was they employed violence as their tool to be able to destroy, the group. And there are lots of stories and pretty, horrific ones of the stories of the martyrs, that happened during the time of the persecutions. Over the period of centuries, guys, centuries, 200 years after the time of Revelation, there were still persecutions going on, right? And it was dangerous to be a Christian. Just get your head wrapped around that. 200 years of that, right? There's a saying, though, and this came out from this era of the persecutions in the church. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You want something to grow in a field? What do? You got to plant seeds in it. You want the church to grow? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And the more that the blood of the martyrs was spilled upon the ground of the Roman Empire, the more the church grew. They remained faithful to their witness. They remained faithful to proclaiming the good news that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. Even amidst their suffering and their persecutions, they remained faithful. Again and again, these Christians would remain faithful. The word martyr literally means the one who gives witness, right? So we think of martyr as somebody who dies. In its original meaning was just someone who gives a witness and says something and then stands by it, right? So they would say, Jesus is Lord, and they would stand by it. The Romans knew how to use violence as a tool to crush people. I mean, that's what happened to Jesus, right? The Romans used one of their finest tools of violence and terrorism. It was domestic terrorism. It's what it was. To crucify people and leave the crucified prisoners up there long enough so that people could be able to look at them and be able to know this is what Rome does to people who don't get in line, right? There's also the stories of the martyrs, those who were Christians. They were prisoners, right? And they were prisoners who were doomed to die, so the Romans were like, well, if they're doomed to die anyway, let's go ahead and have fun with them. So they'd put them into the Colosseum and have them, use them as target practice, use them as the fodder for the beasts. And so it would be entertainment, right? Hey, come on down to the Colosseum. Today we're going to have, wild beasts ripping apart, condemned criminals.
Today they were days long. They were demanded they had to go for days and days and days to watch these things. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Just one day, yeah.
Yeah, you'd get a new emperor, and the new emperor's like, we will have celebrations for the fact that there's a new emperor, so we're going to spend the next week or month. Or they kept trying to outdo each other. And they'd be like, oh, well, the last guy did a dozen condemned criminals who got eaten by lions, and that was a pretty good crowd pleaser, but I'm going to do 100 condemned criminals who are going to get eaten by lions. Again and again, these horrifying stories of what happened to the martyrs, and yet the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and the church continued to grow. Nobody could figure it out. What was making these Christians be able to endure even suffering and death? What made them strong enough to be able to face up against Rome and be able to say, is that the best you can do? And to keep going forward. The stories of the women martyrs who would go forth, singing hymns, as they went forth to their death. So, by a little after the year 300, the church had been growing already. And it had been growing throughout the Roman world, despite the dangers, actually specifically because of, in some ways. Because it was specifically when the people saw the dedication and the witness of the martyrs that they just couldn't help but be drawn in by what these people would be willing to die for, A little after 300, there's a Roman emperor, Constantine, and I'm not going to get into all the details, and I don't even know that I could give a proper kind of vision of the story of his life. But at a certain point in his life, he shifted the way that the Roman Empire was going to keep going. And there's a famous moment when he kind of accepted the Christian thing, he accepted the sign, in hoc signum vincilis, or something like this, that in this sign, the sign of the cross, you'll have victory. He received this message. And so he made the change. He said, nope, we are now going to have Christianity as being an official religion within the Roman Empire. And right before his own death, he was baptized as a Christian. He probably actually believed in the faith earlier than that, but he knew that his job as emperor meant that he had to do a lot of terrible things, so he kind of wanted to get baptized just before he died.
Well, they didn't have confession.
They didn't have the same sense of like confession that we do. So there's, it just, but he probably had.
People would wait until they thought that they weren't going to sin anymore to be baptized.
So again, a complex story in its way. But what we see at that point, this is a little bit after 300, about 200 years later, after this time of this text, that Babylon had fallen. That Babylon had fallen. And they never had to pick up a sword to do it.
Yeah.
There was no rebellion. There was no coup. There was no, army against army. There was no war. And in the end, Babylon had fallen, and yet Rome was still there. Throughout the Roman Empire afterwards, very quickly, Christianity spread to the point that in later versions of what had been the Roman Empire, especially or the Roman Empire, especially in the western part, well, in both parts, in the east and the west, the Roman Empire basically got renamed and became like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Specifically saying that we're in this. We've sort of, how do you want to say that the entire empire itself had been in a sense baptized and converted, right? And that what you see happening from that is for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, that in those places that had been part of the Roman Empire and part of its sphere of influence and so forth, that even hundreds and hundreds of years later, it was a place for Christians. What we see prophesied in this book of Revelation, in this chapter 18 especially, is the fall of Babylon. And if we were to translate that and say, well, that would be the fall of Rome, right? We might be tempted to say, well, when did the Roman Empire fall apart? And you could argue in somewhere in the 5th century or something like that, at least in the West. The Roman Empire fell apart in kind of the 5th century or so, 5th, 6th century. And you might say, well, that's the end of Rome, right? Except no, that's not when, as we're talking about here, Babylon the Great fell. Babylon the Great fell when the oppression and the persecutions were gone, right? Because the victory had been achieved through the blood of the martyrs, through their witness and their testimony. I bring this up especially because, reading chapter 18, I'm going to be honest, it makes me feel a little uncomfortable sometimes reading some of these texts. Because you have some of this where it talks about, let me take a particular, verse 6, right? Pay her back as she has paid others. Pay her back double for her deeds. Into her cup pour double what to her has poured. To the measure of her boasting and wantonness, repay in torment and grief. Right? Therefore, verse 8, therefore plagues will come upon you in one day, pestilence and grief and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for the Lord, mighty is the Lord God who judges her. You read passages like that, and you think to yourself, is this going to be, what's the answer to, the problem of Rome or the problem of these powers that are against God's people or that worship the idols, right? And you read passages like this, and I think it would be easy to draw the conclusion that, well, if God's will is that it needs to be paid back and paid back double, right, then maybe it's time to start, putting together an army so we can go and do God's will, right? And go hunt down all of these enemies and be able to destroy them, right? It'd be very easy to kind of make that conclusion. Nowadays it'd be guns, right? You know, IEDs, whatever, right? And indeed, throughout the history of the world, and even throughout the history of Christianity, that's the way that some of these texts have been taken. You know, you think about something like, I can't get into all the historical complexities of it, but at least in a broad sense, something like the Crusades, right? And although there's complexities to it, but a big part of it, unfortunately, was, yeah, we're going to go back and we're going to go claim the Holy Land for the Christians. And how are we going to do that? By using the weapons of this world. We're going to go in there and we're going to clear it out with swords and blades and with weapons, right? So that's what happened during the Crusades, right? We could see this same sort of, thing happen. People declaring wars because they're saying, well, God wants us to, defeat the unrighteous, right? So therefore they declare wars on behalf of God.
Joseph Stalin said, the Pope, how many tanks does he have?
True. Oh, this is great. This is perfect. Yes.
And then the Pope overthrew.
Right. Yeah. Stalin is here, and he's playing exactly this role, right? Of he's the modern day, 20th century, Babylon the Great, right? And he said, how many battalions does the Pope have, right? And yet, fallen is the USSR, right? And yet the Pope's still there and he's still doing fine, right? Right? There's a long and very sad history of religious wars, right? And we can see it in ancient times. We could see it in modern times. I mean, that's what, we talk about, even like 9/11 attacks and things like that have happened. Violence being used in the name of God, right, to justify the violence, and to do so because there are people who are saying, well, this is what God wants us to do, right? Because we have to be able to destroy the enemies of God. And again, it would be easy to read some of these texts in this sort of way, in a very vindictive kind of way, right? But I want us to be very clear about the history of this particular situation, right? These particular people who lived and received these messages, what were they told was going to be the weapon that would win the victory, right? Be faithful to your witness. You will overcome by blood, but not the blood of your enemies, but the blood of your own witness. The sacrifice that you're willing to make for the sake of Jesus and the gospel. It's the blood of the Lamb that will bring about the victory, not the blood of the enemies, right? And what do we see happening with this prophetic vision, right? Babylon was overthrown without a war. That's what it means to have victory as Christians. It doesn't mean we destroy all of our enemies. It means that we go out and we give that witness and we accept whatever the sacrifice is that is necessary to stay faithful to that witness. And does that mean that we're going to be safe in this? No, it does not. It means that we will accept, if we're going to be part of this, we have to accept the fact that we are going to be taking some sacrifice for it. We're not going to be safe. Our families are not necessarily going to be safe, except for the fact that God will have the ultimate victory. And it's the blood of the martyrs, it's the willingness to sacrifice that becomes the seed of the church. We will not overcome the idols and the powers of Babylon back then and now, right? with the weapons of this world. If we try to, well, we look back on things like the Crusades or the 30 Years' War or any of these other sorts of conflicts, and there's just not much to be proud of with Christians going out and killing in that way. But what the early Christians did with their witness and their martyrdom, we have everything to be proud of that. And we can look to that as a true witness, if you will, of what it means to have victory over Babylon back then and now. And it won't happen with the weapons of this world. God will bring about the victory, but it comes about through the power of the witness and the sacrifice that is made because of it. So I think this chapter 18 is, it's a powerful chapter. Again, it makes me a little uncomfortable reading some of it sometimes because it does have this language that can be very vindictive at times. And yet when we put it in context, what we truly see is that it's not the weapons of this world that will win the victory, but it will be when we follow the path. Basically, it's the same thing that Jesus did. Jesus didn't pick up a sword. What did he do instead? He offered his own life as the sacrifice. That is what wins the victory. Okay. So that is pretty much our time for today. We're already at a little after 4 o'clock. So next time, looks like we're going to have time for, this seems about right. Next time we're going to have a chance to go through the final chapters. It'll be our final session together. Chapter 19 and chapter 20. Just looking forward a little bit on this. Basically is the setup for the kind of final confrontation between God and evil, right? We saw the fall of Babylon the Great, which was the beast and the woman, right? And the false prophet, right? But if you remember our paradigm, there's still one more power of darkness that has not yet been defeated, right? The dragon, right? There's still one more power of darkness that has not yet been defeated. So that's what 19 and 20, we'll take a look at that. That sets up the final kind of confrontation between the dragon, the kind of ultimate, source of evil that called forth the beast and the harlot in the first place, right? And then when we get to the last chapters here, 20, 21, 22, 21, yeah. Yeah, 21. There's a little bit in chapter 22. Chapter 1 and chapter 22. When we get to these last chapters, 21 and chapter 22, we will have the vision of the New Jerusalem. So this is going to be kind of the opposite of the Babylon that had fallen. We're now going to be seeing, and who is the harlot, we're now going to be seeing the bride of the Lamb, who is the New Jerusalem and the heavenly city. Okay? And that's where the book of Revelation ends. So that'll be next time. We'll do all of that.
Another one for the epilogue.
Yeah, I know. Well, the epilogue is just really short, so somehow we'll fit that in. 2 weeks from now, it'll be on the 19th. Yeah? Okay. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.